Welcome to the UN University. Thank you for joining us online. We come to you from Tokyo, where UNU is headquartered. And this evening in Tokyo, we'll be engaging in a public conversation in this room with Ambassador Motohide Yoshikawa, who has returned very recently to Japan from New York, where he was Japan's permanent representative at the United Nations, with the added interesting feature that Japan was on the Security Council during your final year in New York.
That's right.
So this evening we'll be talking about Japan and the UN, and I think you've identified a few challenges you feel Japan faces at the UN. So why don't you tell us about one of them?
Rector Malone, David, thank you very much for this opportunity. As he just outlined, I have served at the Japanese mission to the United Nations until last summer. And in the previous incarnation, I was also in New York, almost at the same time as David was at the head of the IPA. Now, tonight I would like to speak about three challenges that Japan faces in the United Nations. In the early 1990s, I was given a post of Director of the United Nations Political Affairs. At that time, we had three issues at hand. One was the Japanese participation to the peacekeeping operations. We just started the first ever military participation to peacekeeping operations in Cambodia.
Yes.
Second was the reform of the Security Council.
Yes.
The end of the Cold War.
Yes.
The people started to think that Security Council now can work, and reform is a big agenda. So I spent a lot of time on this Security Council reform. The third was the North Korea's nuclear crisis. This started in 1993 that they decided to withdraw from the NPT, and then we know that they have been doing secretly the development of nuclear development. This ended by the framework agreement between the United States and North Korea. You may remember the Jimmy Carter's visit to Pyongyang.
Indeed.
So these were the three issues, among many, but most important three issues. Exactly 20 years later, in 2013, I went to New York as a permanent representative, and I found these three issues still vivid and the important agenda, challenges, not only for Japan, but for the entire United Nations. So these are the three issues.
Why don't we start with reform of the Security Council, which has been, as you imply, moving very slowly since the early 90s. I think we started discussing it seriously in New York in 1993, I seem to remember.
That's right.
And very little progress since then.
It is unfortunately the situation is just as we left in 1993 or 5. There is still a strong consensus among all members that the Security Council has to be reformed. Security Council, which reflected the reality of the world politics in 1945, is no longer valid. It has become very obsolete. There are new emerging powers, countries which were not existing in 1945, countries who were defeated in the war, but who came back as the strong contributor to the peace and security of the world. Why don't we bring in these new faces or old faces to the architecture of the Security Council? I think we had one progress or one height of a possible agreement in 2005. The group of 4 countries presented the draft proposal expanding both permanent and non-permanent membership.
And the 4 countries were Japan, Germany, India, and Brazil, I seem to remember.
And this proposal was met with opposition by China and the United States among the permanent 5, and Africa. Africa could not agree among themselves who would become their sort of candidates to sit in the Security Council as permanent members. It was not put on a vote. And I should say that since 2005, this momentum is gradually lowering compared with the 2005, while there is continuation of frustration of inaction or inability of the Security Council to face the real challenges. I mean, Syria is a case in point. I am sure that the movement to reach to, I mean, this is an issue that probably consensus is very difficult to be achieved. But I think 2/3 majority of the membership, which is 129 out of 193, is possible. And how can we start the ball rolling by presenting a draft proposal which gathers more than 100 votes? That would start the real discussion. And I think the group of 4 countries who have started this exercise should be the ones who should push this the ball. And I think the key is the unity of Africa. What Africa wants from this Security Council. Nobody is from Africa in the permanent membership, and so Africa is very important. That's how I see.
Great. Well, my perception was that none of the 3 major powers in the Security Council were keen on reform. And while 1 or 2 of them could have lived with it, not all of them could live with Security Council reform. And because in Africa there are several very important states rather than 1 important state, I think that made it a lot more difficult for Africans to agree than if there had been 1 clear African great power around which the rest would have coalesced, but just a personal view. The second challenge, perhaps North Korea, you mentioned it's in the news a great deal again. One of President Trump's early files, because he's expressed himself strongly on North Korea. It was obviously a topic of conversation when President Xi visited him recently. Where do you think we are on North Korea?
I think it is important to look back what had happened in the past 20 years. Very frankly speaking, the negotiation with the DPRK, North Korea's regime, has been a series of disappointment, to say the least. China, who is the neighbor as well as the only ally of the North Korea, has been calling for peaceful settlement, negotiation. We all agree with that. There was this agreed framework of 1994. Japanese Prime Minister Koizumi went to Pyongyang twice. There is an agreement between the 2 leaders. 6-party talk also almost achieved an agreement that North Korea give up the nuclear development, and we would give massive development assistance so that they would be incorporated into the world community, betterment of their human rights situation. So these bases of agreement are there. Meanwhile, the government has pursued, without telling us, both nuclear and the missile capability. And this has been very steady development. We have to face the reality that they have become a mighty military power.
And of course, it's very close geographically to Japan.
Yes, not only Japan, South Korea is a neighbor to the North Korea, and their missile can reach the American continent now. So we are in a new phase of reality, and I hope the resolve of international community embodied in series of Security Council resolutions be implemented so that the government of North Korea understands where the public opinion lies. Nobody is asking the North Korea to change their regime. We are asking them to give up nuclear arsenal, which is the violation of international law, and the missile to carry these warheads are not necessary. So I am really hoping that the neighboring countries, particularly China, would exercise this influence so that we will be back to the negotiation table, six-party talk, which China started. And there are framework for the engagement. Sanction is not our purpose. Purpose is to have a peaceful, nuclear-free Korean Peninsula so that the people of North Korea live better.
Indeed. Now, the third topic you mentioned, peacekeeping, and Japan did start in Cambodia. Subsequently, it played a very useful role in East Timor, it seems to me. It was on the Golan Heights. And at the moment, it is still in South Sudan. So I wanted to ask you how this adventure for Japan with UN peacekeeping has been evolving, and how you see it as a challenge to Japan or for Japan.
The peacekeeping operations from the very beginning, it has been a challenge for Japan because of the Article 9 of Japanese Constitution, which prohibits use of force except for the defense of self-defense of Japan. It took a long time, until 1992, for Japan to be able to start participating in a military contingents in the peacekeeping operations. We have come, for that matter, a long way. This is exactly 25 years ago, June, 25 years ago. Now, during these 25 years, I think there is one, strong support by the public to the participation to peacekeeping operations. Two, the Japan, particularly Japanese self-defense force, has acquired lots of experience through the participation of in various peacekeeping operations. We have men and women who have served and ready to go again. At the same time, the peacekeeping operations of the United Nations has changed since the prototype of the separation of forces, truce and observation, to the more dynamic, comprehensive operations of Cambodia, former Yugoslavia. And now in Africa you have more robust peacekeeping operations whose military force has more mandate to use force in order to protect the civilians, and also the ready to fight if the needs arises. This change or evolution of peacekeeping operations of the United Nations make Japan more difficult to go to this robust peacekeeping operations because of the domestic legal restrictions which still exist. You may remember the recent parliamentary debate over the whether to stay or leave South Sudan, and so this issue is still here. I want to tonight touch upon a little bit of this restrictions or where Japan stands on this peacekeeping operations in a bit of a historical context. Try to underline that there is still a lot of room for Japan to widen, deepen our participation or our relationship with the peacekeeping operations, because I don't think it is only the military participation to the peacekeeping operation that we can do. There are other ways to support the UN PKOs, which is vital for the UN. For example, how to strengthen the troop contributors of Africa in the preparation of the soldiers, in transportation, the installation of infrastructure, not on the fighting, but on the engineering battalion, is where I think Japan has some advantages to upgrade or train the trainers or train the soldiers of African continent, which we have already started. So there are ways that we can participate. There are personnel for the headquarters rather than the infantry. That's also, again, where I think we can expand.
Terrific. Well, Motohide, thank you so much. For those joining us online, thank you for doing so. It's an important debate in Japan. There's quite a lot of discussion of the UN in the environmental field, in various dimensions of the UN's activity, including human rights. So I'm sure we'll have a lively discussion this evening. But we're very grateful to you for joining us also online for a bit to share what it is we'll be talking about this evening.
Thank you very much, David. This is my
wonderful
great pleasure.
to have you here.